We are taught that Paul Volcker saved the American economy from inflation in the early 1980s, that his courage to raise interest rates to unprecedented levels broke the back of runaway price increases and restored confidence in the dollar, that he was a hero of American capitalism who made the tough decisions others wouldn't make. But this is the version written for people who never looked at what happened outside the United States. The truth is that Paul Volcker's decision to raise interest rates to 20% didn't just fight American inflation. It bankrupted 50 countries across Latin America, Africa, and Asia. It triggered the worst debt crisis in modern history. It created a lost decade of economic collapse that killed millions through poverty, malnutrition, and the destruction of public health systems. And it was not an accident, it was a deliberate choice. American inflation would be exported to the developing world. American workers would be protected by sacrificing workers in Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, and dozens of other nations that had borrowed in dollars and could no longer pay. This is the story of how the Federal Reserve destroyed the Third World to save the First World, and why Jerome Powell is following the exact same playbook today. In 1979, the United States was experiencing the worst inflation since the Civil War. Consumer prices were rising at 13.5% annually. A dollar from 1970 was worth 50 cents by 1979. Savings were being destroyed. The middle class was being hollowed out. Gas lines stretched for blocks. The Carter administration appeared helpless. The problem had been building for a decade. The Vietnam War had been funded with deficit spending. President Nixon had closed the gold window in 1971, ending the last restraint on money creation. The 1973 oil crisis had quadrupled energy prices. Wages and prices were locked in an inflationary spiral. Every attempt to control inflation had failed. The Federal Reserve under G. William Miller had been timid. Interest rates rose slightly, then fell when the economy weakened. Inflation expectations became entrenched. People expected prices to keep rising, so they demanded higher wages, which pushed prices higher, which led to demands for even higher wages. The cycle fed on itself. By mid-1979, confidence in the dollar was collapsing. Foreign central banks were dumping treasury bonds. Gold was soaring toward $800 per ounce. The dollar was falling against every major currency. If the trend continued, the United States would face a currency crisis that would dwarf the inflation problem. President Carter understood the stakes. In July 1979, he appointed Paul Volcker as chairman of the Federal Reserve. Volcker was 6'7" imposing and known for his willingness to make unpopular decisions. He believed that inflation was a disease that required radical treatment. Half measures would fail. The only solution was to crush inflation completely. Regardless of the cost, Volcker's plan was simple and brutal. The Federal Reserve would raise interest rates high enough to cause a recession. The recession would destroy demand. Destroyed demand would eliminate inflation. Unemployment would rise. Businesses would fail, but inflation would die. On October 6, 1979, Volcker announced a fundamental shift in Fed policy. The Fed would no longer target interest rates directly. Instead, it would target the money supply. This technical change had enormous practical implications. It meant interest rates would be allowed to rise as high as necessary to control money growth. There would be no ceiling. The federal funds rate, which had been 11% in September 1979, rose rapidly. By December 1979, it reached 14%. By March 1980, it hit 20%. It would fluctuate between 15% and 20% for the next 2 years. 20% interest rates meant that borrowing money became almost impossible. Businesses that needed to borrow to finance inventory couldn't operate. Consumers who needed to borrow to buy cars or homes stopped buying. The housing industry collapsed. Auto sales plummeted. The unemployment rate surged from 6% to over 10%. The American economy entered the worst recession since the Great Depression. Between 1980 and 1982, GDP contracted. Millions of workers lost their jobs. Factories shut down. The Rust Belt became a symbol of industrial collapse. But Volcker didn't flinch. When businesses complained, he ignored them. When workers protested, he continued. When Congress demanded he lower rates, he refused. The only thing that mattered was breaking inflation. And by 1983, inflation had fallen from 13.5% to 2%. The American financial press celebrated Volcker as a hero. The dollar stabilized. Inflation expectations collapsed. The economy began to recover. By 1984, the United States was entering a boom that would last for decades. But the cost of this victory was not paid by Americans alone. It was paid primarily by countries that had borrowed in dollars during the 1970s. In the 1970s, developing countries across Latin America, Africa, and Asia had taken on massive amounts of dollar-denominated debt. The loans came from American and European banks that were flush with petrodollars, the money that oil-producing countries had deposited after the 1973 oil price spike. The mechanics of this borrowing were deceptively simple. A country like Mexico would borrow $1 billion from a consortium of U.S. banks: Citibank, Chase Manhattan, Bank of America. The loan would have a floating interest rate tied to LIBOR plus a spread, typically 2 to 3%. In 1975, with LIBOR at 6%, the effective rate was 8 to 9%. The borrowed dollars would be used to finance infrastructure projects, highways, ports, power plants, or to cover import costs for oil, machinery, and consumer goods. The expectation was that economic growth from these investments would generate export revenues to service the debt. The critical feature was the rollover mechanism. Most of these loans had maturities of 5 to 7 years. When they came due, the countries would simply borrow again to pay off the old loan. As long as banks remained willing to lend, and as long as economic growth continued, the system functioned. Debt levels would rise, but so would GDP. The debt-to-GDP ratio would remain manageable. The banks needed to lend this money to earn returns. Developing countries needed to borrow to finance infrastructure, industrialization, and import costs. The interest rates in the 1970s were low, often below the inflation rate. Borrowing in dollars seemed like a rational decision. Mexico borrowed $80 billion. Brazil borrowed $90 billion. Argentina borrowed $45 billion. Chile borrowed $20 billion. Venezuela, despite being an oil exporter, borrowed $35 billion. Across Latin America, total external debt rose from $75 billion in 1975 to $315 billion by 1982. In Africa and Asia, debt levels followed similar trajectories. The borrowers made two critical assumptions. First, that interest rates would remain low. Second, that they could always refinance or roll over their debts when they came due. Both assumptions were shadowed by Volcker's decision to raise rates to 20%. When U.S. interest rates rose, the interest payments on dollar-denominated debt rose with them. A loan that had cost 5% to service in 1978 now cost 15% or 20% in 1981. Countries that had been able to manage their debt service suddenly found that interest payments consumed 30%, 40% or 50% of their export earnings. Worse, the strong dollar made their debt more expensive in local currency terms. If a country had borrowed $1 billion when the exchange rate was 20 pesos per dollar, they owed 20 billion pesos. But as the dollar strengthened and the peso weakened to 50 per dollar, that same $1 billion debt now represented 50 billion pesos. The real value of the debt had multiplied. Countries tried to pay. They slashed government spending. They cut education and health budgets. They raised taxes. They devalued their currencies, which made imports more expensive and living standards fell. None of it was enough. The debt kept growing faster than their ability to pay. Mexico was the first to break. On August 12, 1982, the Mexican finance minister, Jesus Silva, flew to Washington and delivered the message that would trigger the crisis. Mexico could not make its scheduled debt payments. The country had run out of foreign currency reserves. They were declaring a moratorium on debt service. The numbers were stark. Mexico owed $80 billion to foreign creditors. Debt service for 1982 alone was projected at $14 billion. Mexico's foreign reserves had fallen to less than $200 million. The country literally did not have the dollars to pay. What had happened? The combination was lethal. Oil prices, which had sustained Mexico's economy and provided dollars for debt service, had begun falling in 1981. Mexico's oil revenues dropped from $20 billion in 1981 to $16 billion in 1982. At the same time, the strong dollar made Mexican exports more expensive and less competitive. Tourism revenue fell. Remittances from Mexicans working in the U.S. declined as the American economy entered recession. Meanwhile, the interest payments on Mexico's floating rate debt had exploded. Loans that had cost 8% in 1978 now cost 18 to 20% in 1982. The debt service ratio, the percentage of export earnings needed just to pay interest, had risen from 25% in 1978 to over 50% by 1982. Half of everything Mexico earned from exports went straight to foreign banks. The Mexican government tried everything. They raised taxes, they cut spending, they devalued the peso from 26 per dollar to 150 per dollar, hoping cheaper exports would generate more revenue. None of it worked. The debt grew faster than their ability to pay. Silva Herzog's announcement sent shockwaves through the global financial system. If Mexico couldn't pay, what about Brazil? What about Argentina? What about the dozens of other countries in the same position? The exposure of American banks was enormous. Citibank had lent $3 billion to Mexico alone. Bank of America had lent $5 billion. Chase Manhattan and Manufacturers Hanover had comparable exposures. Across the 9 largest U.S. banks, loans to Latin America exceeded their combined capital by 180%. If these loans defaulted, the banks would be insolvent. Within months, the crisis spread. Brazil, Argentina, Venezuela, Chile, Peru, Ecuador, and more than 40 other countries either defaulted or came to the brink of default. The total debt in default exceeded $300 billion. American and European banks faced losses that threatened their solvency. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank stepped in with emergency loans, but the loans came with conditions. Structural adjustment programs, austerity measures, privatization of state assets, deregulation of markets, wage cuts, subsidy elimination. The conditionality was extensive and specific. Countries had to agree to fiscal austerity. Government budgets had to be slashed, typically by 20 to 30%. This meant cutting education spending, health programs, infrastructure investment, and public sector employment. Trade liberalization, tariffs, and import quotas had to be eliminated. Domestic industries that had been protected suddenly faced competition from cheaper imports. Factories closed, workers were laid off. Privatization, state-owned enterprises, airlines, telecommunications, utilities, oil companies had to be sold to private investors, often foreign corporations at fire sale prices. Wage suppression. Public sector wages were frozen or cut. Minimum wage laws were weakened. The goal was to make labor cheaper to improve export competitiveness. Subsidy removal. Subsidies on food, fuel, and basic goods were eliminated. Prices for essential items spiked, hitting the poorest hardest. Currency devaluation. Countries were often forced to devalue further, making imports more expensive and eroding purchasing power. The goal was to make the countries able to pay their debts. The method was to squeeze their economies until they generated enough export surplus to service the loans. The cost was borne by the populations. Mexico received $3.9 billion from the IMF in 1983 in exchange for implementing these measures. Brazil received $5.4 billion. Argentina received $2.2 billion. Each loan came with detailed conditions specifying exactly what had to be cut, privatized, and deregulated. The results were measured not in economic growth but in debt service capacity. Did the country generate enough dollars to pay foreign creditors? That was the metric. Whether people could eat, whether children could go to school, whether hospitals had medicines, these were secondary concerns. Latin America entered what became known as the lost decade. From 1982 to 1992, per capita income across the region fell. In some countries it declined by 20% or more. Unemployment soared. Poverty rates doubled. Infant mortality rose. Life expectancy stagnated. Public health systems collapsed from lack of funding. In Mexico, real wages fell by 50% between 1982 and 1988. In Argentina, inflation reached 3,000% annually as the government printed money to cover deficits. In Brazil, the economy stagnated for a decade while debt service consumed the majority of government revenues. The human cost was staggering. Millions of children suffered malnutrition. Vaccination programs were cut. Water and sanitation systems deteriorated. Education budgets were slashed, and literacy rates declined. An entire generation saw their economic prospects destroyed. But from the perspective of the Federal Reserve and the U.S. Treasury, the policy had worked. American inflation was defeated. The dollar was stable. American banks, though stressed, survived. The developing world had absorbed the cost of America's adjustment. Volcker retired in 1987, celebrated as the man who saved the dollar. His willingness to tolerate a recession at home to fight inflation became the template for central banking for the next 3 decades. The model was clear. When faced with a choice between domestic inflation and global instability, choose global instability. The lesson for developing countries was equally clear. Never borrow in a currency you don't control. If you do, you are at the mercy of the country that issues that currency. And that country will protect its own interests without regard for yours. Today, the pattern is repeating, but the target is different, and the scale is larger. In the decade following the 2008 financial crisis, the Federal Reserve held interest rates near zero. From 2008 to 2021, the federal funds rate averaged less than 1%. Money was free. Global borrowing exploded. Emerging market countries took on trillions of dollars in new debt. Turkey, Argentina, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Egypt, Kenya, and dozens of others borrowed heavily, assuming that low rates would persist. Corporations in these countries issued dollar-denominated bonds to finance expansion. Then came 2022. Inflation returned to the United States. Not 13.5% like 1979, but 9%, the highest in 4 decades. The Federal Reserve, under Chairman Jerome Powell, faced the same choice Volcker had faced: allow inflation to persist or raise rates and export the pain. Powell chose the Volcker path. In March 2022, the federal funds rate was 0.25%. By July 2023, it had risen to 5.5%, the fastest rate increase in 40 years. The effects on emerging markets were immediate. Countries with dollar-denominated debts saw their borrowing costs explode. Currencies collapsed. Turkey's lira lost 80% of its value. Argentina's peso fell into hyperinflation. Pakistan's rupee crashed. Sri Lanka was the first to break in 2022. The country defaulted on its external debt. The government ran out of foreign currency to pay for essential imports. Fuel shortages paralyzed the economy. Food prices spiked. Protests erupted. The government fell. The chain of causation was direct. Sri Lanka owed $51 billion in external debt, much of it dollar-denominated. When U.S. rates rose, the cost of servicing that debt increased. Meanwhile, the strong dollar made imports, fuel, food, medicine more expensive. Foreign currency reserves, which had been $7.6 billion in 2019, fell to under $2 billion by early 2022. By April 2022, the country had no fuel for power plants. Electricity was rationed to a few hours per day. Hospitals ran out of medicine. Schools closed. The economy contracted by 8% in a single year. President Gotabaya Rajapaksa fled the country as protesters stormed his residence. Pakistan followed. By 2023, the country was on the brink of default. External debt exceeded $100 billion. Inflation reached 30%. Foreign reserves fell below $3 billion, barely enough to cover 1 month of imports. The IMF imposed another round of austerity. Electricity prices rose 50%. Fuel subsidies were eliminated. The rupee was devalued by 25% in exchange for $3 billion in emergency funding. The human cost was immediate. Millions fell below the poverty line. Infant mortality rates rose. Malnutrition increased. Power outages lasted 12 hours per day. Factories shut down because they couldn't operate without reliable electricity. Egypt faced a similar crisis. External debt reached $163 billion by 2023. The pound lost 50% of its value in 1 year. Inflation hit 35%. The government secured $3 billion from the IMF, but the conditions required cutting fuel subsidies and raising electricity prices. Bread prices doubled. Protests were met with arrests. Kenya, with $70 billion in external debt, saw its shilling lose 30% in 2023. Tunisia defaulted on domestic debt. Zambia restructured $6.3 billion in Eurobonds. Ghana, despite being one of Africa's success stories, faced a debt crisis that required $3 billion in IMF support. The pattern was identical across all these countries. Dollar-denominated debt accumulated during the decade of near-zero U.S. rates. Rising American interest rates increased debt service costs. Strong dollar made imports expensive and local currencies weaker. Reserves depleted. Default or IMF intervention became inevitable. Austerity followed. The total amount of debt at risk exceeded $1 trillion. The number of countries facing potential default was higher than in 1982. The human cost, measured in lost income, malnutrition, and deteriorating public services, was already visible. But from the Federal Reserve's perspective, the policy was working. American inflation was falling. By mid-2024, it had dropped to 3%. The labor market remained strong. The U.S. economy avoided recession. The global instability was, once again, someone else's problem. Powell, like Volcker, is being celebrated in American financial media as a steady hand. The willingness to raise rates despite political pressure is portrayed as courage. The fact that those rate increases are destroying economies across the developing world is mentioned, if at all, as an unfortunate but necessary side effect. The Federal Reserve does not have a mandate to protect Sri Lanka or Pakistan or Argentina. Its mandate is to maintain price stability and maximum employment in the United States. When those goals conflict with global stability, the choice is predetermined. This is not a conspiracy. It is a structural feature of a global economy where one country issues the reserve currency and sets interest rates that affect every other country. The issuer will always prioritize its own economy. The rest of the world will absorb the consequences. The difference between Volcker's era and today is that the developing world is more aware of the pattern. They have seen this movie before, and some are attempting to build alternatives. China has created currency swap lines with dozens of countries, allowing bilateral trade to bypass the dollar. The BRICS nations are developing alternative payment systems. Countries are accumulating gold and reducing dollar reserves. These efforts are slow and incomplete. The dollar remains dominant, but the cracks are visible. The trust that the United States will manage the global reserve currency in a way that considers global welfare has been shattered. Twice in 40 years, the Fed has raised rates to solve American problems while bankrupting countries that had borrowed in dollars. The message is clear. If you borrow in dollars, you are a hostage to American monetary policy. When the United States needs to fight inflation, you will pay the price. Your protests will be ignored. Your suffering will be dismissed as unfortunate but necessary. Your economy will be sacrificed to protect American price stability. This is not about morality, it is about power. The country that issues the reserve currency has the power to export its economic problems, and it will use that power when necessary. Volcker's legacy is not just that he defeated American inflation, it is that he demonstrated the utility of the dollar as a weapon. When faced with a domestic crisis, raise rates. The cost will be borne by countries that borrowed in your currency. Their collapse is a feature, not a bug. Powell is following the same script. The rate increases of 2022 to 2023 were necessary to fight American inflation. The fact that they are triggering debt crises across the developing world is noted but not determinative. The Fed's job is to protect the U.S. economy. Global stability is someone else's responsibility. The countries that are collapsing today understood the risk. They borrowed in dollars anyway because they had no better option. Access to capital required dollar borrowing. Exports were priced in dollars. Reserves were held in dollars. They were trapped in a system where the rules are set by someone else, and those rules change based on that someone else's needs. The lesson of the Volcker shock is the same as the lesson of the Plaza Accord and the petrodollar system. International economic institutions are not neutral. They reflect power relationships. And when those power relationships shift, the institutions will be used to maintain the existing hierarchy. Volcker raised rates to 20% in 1980 and destroyed 50 countries. Powell raised rates to 5% in 2023 and triggered the same pattern. The percentages are different, the mechanism is identical, and the outcome, for the developing world, will be the same. Another lost decade, another generation sacrificed, another reminder that in a dollar-dominated world, American priorities come first and everyone else absorbs the cost. This is Decoded Economics. Subscribe to see the future before it arrives.